In our current political and cultural moment, certain terms and phrases seem to have taken on new and potentially different meanings, possibly none more controversial than the concept of white supremacy. The Attorney General said recently that white supremacist violence is the most dangerous threat to our democracy. Given the division and fear that such accusations engender, is it worth asking, what is white supremacy? And what does the Bible have to say in response? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. So, welcome to Theology on Air. Theology on Air is an outgrowth of Theology on Tap, which is a ministry for young adults here in Houston where we drink craft beer and we talk about theology and philosophy and faith and culture and all kinds of juicy topics. And then in the podcast, we get to kind of go even more in depth with those things. And today's podcast is actually kind of a primer as we get ready to go into our next live event, which is October 11th, about this issue of white supremacy. Has the definition and term changed? What does it mean? How do we respond to that? So I'm going to tell you about our two guests, and I'm going to let them talk in just a second. But if you like Theology on Air, like us, rate us, review us, subscribe, whatever the thing is that you can do on whatever the platform it is that you're listening or watching on. Ring the bell, give us 5 stars. Maybe it's 4. I don't know. As many stars as there are, that's as many as we want. And you can also check out upcoming events and information about us at HoustonTOT.com. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, which is a church on the west side of Houston. I'm joined by, as usual, with Evan McClanahan. He is the pastor at First Lutheran in Midtown Houston. But today, instead of being like my co-host, he's going to be kind of talking about the topic like one of our guests. And then we have a very special guest, new to the show, Joseph Parks. Joseph Parks is the youth and young adult minister at Riceville Mount Olive Baptist Church in Houston, Texas. He's a graduate of North Carolina Central University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Administration with a marketing concentration. He's also a graduate of the Morehouse School of Religion at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia. That is a mouthful, sir. Where he received his Master of Divinity degree with a concentration in Afrocentric Christian education. So really pertinent to what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to both of you. Excited to have you.
Thanks for coming, Joseph.
I'm glad to be here.
Like I said, today we're going to be opening up some pretty sensitive topics, talking about white supremacy, talking about racism. This is just meant to kind of tee up and be kind of a teaser for our upcoming live event. But I do want to just clarify a few things up front. As you know, we pride ourselves at Theology on Tap and Theology on Air in being able to charitably disagree. I think that's going to be showcased today by both of these gentlemen. But also I want to be very clear, and we're going to say this at the live event as well, that no one is saying that white supremacy doesn't exist or that racism doesn't exist. That's not the question on the table. The question is not, does it exist? The question is, does it mean what you think it means when you say those words? Has the definition changed? How is it affecting our lives today? What does the gospel have to say? So I just wanted to clarify that for anyone that's like, I can't believe they're talking about this. Of course it exists. Are you going to talk about gravity next? We get it. It exists. And it's wicked.
People have said something like that, I think.
Yeah. So listen with an open mind and let's see what these guys have to say. So let's do this before we fully dive into defining terms and stuff, because you're new and we're excited to have a new voice. Maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself in general, and then how you came to be interested in conversations like these. And then we'll spar a little maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
First step in not being long-winded. Raised in a Christian home, was baptized at 6 years old, went my own path, graduated from North Carolina Central. I think, the basis of, I went through that process of being raised in a Christian home and then being rebellious, having a reprobate mind, just trying to turn my own way. And that proved so critical for my ministry, for my belief, my faith, understanding is my own. It's not an embedded theology. And so how I came into conversations like this, it actually started, I remember when I had this infatuation with preachers. My dad, he prioritized ecumenicity.
Yeah. Tell people that don't know what that word means.
Ecumenicity is basically just the fellowship, the meeting, even conversations, just the efforts of trying to unite different Christian expressions. I wouldn't even limit it to denominations, because I think, I've been exposed to Orthodox Christianity, the Coptic Church, and I value so many of those Christian expressions. But my dad, he prioritized that. And I remember, going to white churches, white preachers coming to him for revivals. And that was a major emphasis. And it wasn't shared, especially in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I was born. And my favorite preacher, E.V. Hill. For a lot of black preachers, they didn't like Billy Graham, but he actually had an admiration for him, and he was equally admired by so many preachers, and seeing him preach in so many different circles. And then lastly, ITC. During my seminary training, I was exposed, and it hurt me, it haunted me, and it was such a confrontation, being exposed to the social implications of our religious understanding. There's classes: Bible, Gender, and Sex, Systematic Theology, Sociology of Religion, Philosophy and Theology, being exposed to how women are not, how the patriarchy in church. And just so that was the foundation of my seminary training. So that's how I came interested into those conversations.
That's interesting. When we talked on the phone, so for those of you that know, Theology on Tap is ecumenical, right? Our leadership team is made up of Baptist, Lutheran, Episcopal, Presbyterian, Methodist, on and on. And when we were talking, I was like pitching it because I was hoping he'd say yes to coming on the podcast and telling all about it. And he was really quiet. He's a good listener. He was so quiet. I was like, I don't think he's going to bite. And then I finished and he goes something like, man, you had me at Charitably Disagree. Like, I love this. So it sounds like you've experienced that growing up, the value of having different perspectives.
Absolutely.
So I'm really glad you're here. Welcome.
And we want to hear it, so be sure to just talk right into that mic. You can pull it even a little closer still.
All right.
Yeah.
If you want, you can even take it out of the thing and just hold it.
I'm yelling now.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's your yelling?
I'm yelling.
Okay,
from now
let's
on.
not get crazy.
A natural modesty. I love it.
Aw.
That's good.
So Evan, our
Is this where
upcoming
you're gonna blame
topics.
me?
Yeah, we're gonna blame you.
It's
Yeah.
fine. I was going to admit it. So
Our topics for Theology on Tap going forward, at least for a while, this is the system that seems to be working, is we let people choose them. We put several options on a poll and people vote on what the next one will be. But those options are put on the poll by those of us in leadership. And I'm not bitter, but mine came in last time, so I lost. But the one that got the most votes was the one that you suggested. So this topic is your idea because it's something that is around us and being talked about all the time. So maybe start by giving us some of your thoughts and reasons that went into having such a sensitive conversation.
yeah, and I chose I wanted the topic to include the phrase white supremacy, okay? Because not just something about racial reconciliation or something to that effect, not just something to acknowledge the reality of racism, but really I think to acknowledge a change in the way we're talking about racism. I think a more extreme way we're talking about it, which is things like, white supremacy, systemic racism, things of that nature. And you look at some more kind of popular level things like 1619 Project and things of that nature. It seems to me like the conversation has changed, and it seems like the way that we talk about concepts has changed. So when I was a kid, white supremacists were members of the Klan, neo-Nazis, skinheads, that sort of thing. It was a fringe group. It was roundly rejected. Very, very few people on the whole are members of something like the KKK today. But it wasn't that long ago, in the mid-1920s, when 15% of the eligible population in America was a member of the KKK. They had many, many millions of people. So I'm certainly not denying that in our history there is I don't know the word, synchronicity between racism and white supremacy. The question is that still the case, today? Because I think the Klan has something like 4,500-ish members. It's a secret society, so, who can say, but it's very, very few. But I wanted to get at, really the way this has changed, because as a Christian, I don't think the way that we're talking about it is helpful. I feel like, now, if people are going to say, well, of course you feel that way. You're supposed to feel that way. You're the white guy. So you're being defensive. This is your white fragility showing, et cetera, et cetera. But all that being the case, maybe that is all true. I just don't feel like a path toward racial reconciliation. I don't think this is the road we would want to go down. I think to call someone a racist is something that, as Christians, we would say needs to be evidenced. To basically change the conversation so that one cannot deny it without actually proving it, which is the case. If I were to say I'm not a racist, people would say, of course you're a racist. In fact, you're such a racist, you don't even know how much of a racist you are because you're denying your racism. That's where the conversation, I think, really has changed. And so I think that as Christians, and I can only operate from a Christian worldview, we're not giving people the benefit of the doubt. People are presumed guilty before any evidence is shown. We're not honoring the eighth commandment or the ninth, depending on how you number, on bearing false witness, I think. I think that would be the real problem. When we talk about racism and white supremacy being so pervasive through the culture that it's inescapable, it's a way of saying that a white person, or even black people, as I have a number of examples to show, are basically called white supremacists if they deny certain tenets. Tenets, I think, largely of the left. But all of that said, I think it's worth talking about because I think in the church, in the gospel, we have an answer to pervasive sins, of which racism is perhaps our greatest national sin. So I'm not denying that it's a problem, but I do think the gospel offers a solution and a path forward. And so if the church embraces this, what I would consider to be accusatory language, I don't think that it's helpful. So, but I'm guessing that others would say, well, you're naive or you don't understand the depth of the problem because it's a position you enjoy.
Right.
Being the
because of your
dominant
privilege.
culture. Right.
So it sounds already like we're going to have to define some terms, but that's a helpful kind of intro. Before we get to all of the term defining and looking at the articles, as you hear him talk, do you have any kind of thoughts or responses just off top?
I think there are several points where I agree with, and then I think there are several points where I wouldn't say that I disagree with, but I think would need further clarification to even take a stance against. And one of the practices we used to use in our class called clinical psychology for providing pastoral care was, sometimes when we're passionate in class, we would do this. And this is another thing that we do. This is something else that we do. And it would be people, from the perspective of church hurt, and then people who were being apologists. And I've been labeled conservative. We just throw out that pronoun, we, or pronouns that they. And I think that needs to be clarified in order for not only, again, for not an agreement or disagreement, but even I think it makes it a little bit more of an authentic conversation. I think it's more effective. We're going to talk about strategies. And so who is the we? Who is the we? Because we have so many different expressions of Christianity. We have so many different expressions of what does it mean to be a Christian? What is the construct of Christianity? And so for me, that's my only response, my initial response to everything. I think there is a lot of generic terms there that doesn't help in the conversations for us to be as effective as we can, because I think these conversations are necessary. And another tool that I learned at an interfaith coalition for religious freedom, they said there's a major difference between tolerating people and engaging people. And what
we talked about this on the phone a while. Yeah, say some more about that.
So the difference is tolerating puts you in a power dynamic, whereas you have the right to entertain.
Right. I will tolerate you.
I will tolerate you. And a deep thing, God being just perfect in all of God's ways, we see, dare I say, even the same toleration of Satan and Job. That Satan, who has no dominion, has no place, has this, what seems to be this reign, this freedom to even share. He's even asked, what are you doing here? And he's given room to speak in what, oh man, we're not allowed in the garden, but here's Satan in heaven, or whatever you want to understand that as. So I think that's one thing, but that's something, and engaging, it puts this democracy in conversations. And so, but other than that, I just think that there's a lot of clarification as it relates to who are the we's, and that will help us move forward in the conversation.
And maybe for the sake of our conversation today, so the title for the upcoming event is White Supremacy a Real Problem in America? So one, we're talking about America. for the purposes of our conversation. And then when we use the term we, maybe we can just have some understanding that that's, well, right now it's the three of us here in this room, but that it's the Orthodox Christian Church as expressed by like us, but also the people that are on leadership for Theology on Tap. People, maybe the we could be people that genuinely want to understand how the gospel can speak to this kind of wickedness. Is that a fair way to say it? So that if we're using that term, we're kind of on the same page.
Okay, if that's what he's agreeing with.
I'll just say if I use it, stop me and say, what do you mean by we? Yeah, because
are you talking about just all white people? Are you talking about
because there would be
Lutherans?
Yeah, there would be several groups, that I may have referenced that would be pertinent. White people, Christians, and
the
Americans.
Left,
and the left. I didn't say we as a part of that.
No.
Yeah. So no, I totally agree. I think clarity is important, and so.
Yeah, my teacher, I just remember her always saying, I would be, and this is another thing that we do, and she'd be, oh, stop.
We don't do that.
Who is the we? And a lot of times it would dismantle what we were theorizing about.
Mm-hmm.
That's I remember just sometimes being floored at a very relevant case. I remember one teacher, he was in class and he was saying, you know what white people do? Of course, it's HBCU. White people do this when they wake up. I'm the conqueror of the world.
Oh my gosh.
And we had a white woman in the class and she says, no, I don't do that. Yeah. And he was like, oh, you don't count. And he just dismissing and how white supremacy, how these terms have come up. That's what white scientists, great people who have founded some of these schools that we pride, they've discounted and dismissed a lot of, and just lumped a lot of people into the we's and into this is what that means. And so I think that more than the danger, I think it's sometimes ineffective in some of the efforts we're trying to do with conversations.
We shoot ourselves in the foot by doing that. I think that probably happened at our last event when we talked about evangelicalism, why people walk away from the church. There was a lot of like, we do this wrong, we do that wrong. And then I think some of us are like, well, but we don't all do that. Like not all churches are giving this terrible messaging and or being not inclusive on these things or whatever. But so let's maybe talk about some of the fine tuning of these terms. I hate to even ask it because it's kind of the whole point. But when we say white supremacy, maybe we can get a definition of that. I don't know if we need to. We're not going to go back into history and trace all the way through how it's changed. But do you think that it has taken on a different meaning? And then maybe we could agree on what white supremacy is, maybe what it was and what it is now. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
We could rock, paper, scissors, shoot for it.
Rock, paper, scissors.
I yield to you.
Well, so again, I mean, this isn't something I've studied at an academic level. Okay. And I understand that, I really appreciate like Francis Schaeffer's old way of understanding, sort of analyzing the way that concepts end up in society. And he has this kind of thing where it begins in philosophy, then it ends up in art and music. And the last place it ends up is in theology. And there's a few steps I skipped along the way. But in other words, what philosophers are talking about, 50 years ago is in the pulpit tomorrow kind of thing. And so something like white supremacy, I'm certain has been around as and this parallels with, of course, critical theory. So much has been said about critical race theory. As a concept that's been in the legal schools for law schools for 30, 40 years, but it sort of morphed into, well, there's this kind of critical theory, there's critical race theory, there's critical gender theory, there's critical this theory, just like liberation theology. When I was in seminary, most of my theology classes were varieties of liberation theology. Well, liberation theology originated in the 1960s in Latin America, and it was really more economic disparity and sort of communism, with a Christian veneer was how but by the time, I was in seminary in the 2000s, there was Black liberation theology, womanist liberation theology, feminist liberation theology, Korean Native American. There was like every version of liberation
left-handed.
Theology. No. So anyway, critical race theory and white supremacy, I think those two things go along. So these are sort of academic developments where ideas are sort of getting, unfolding. And I'm not an expert in those. And we did actually, ask someone who's more of an expert at these things than me, who wasn't quite comfortable talking about these sorts of things, because we could have had 4 or 5 people talk about all this. But Here's the thing. Let's just say that the academy and the journalism schools and all of that, they talk about white supremacy in a way that's different from what I grew up with. Okay?
Yeah.
I grew up with it being a fringe understanding of white dominance, Aryan myths, silliness.
Well, that
silliness.
white people view themselves as superior,
As a
better.
superior race.
Okay.
Exactly. And of course, white people aren't the only people to have those views. People
Sure.
of all colors, there are all groups of people that hold those views about their own people. But that said, whites are the dominant, group in America. So it's a particularly pernicious, ideology, of course, because they have more power. But that said, so it kind of had this meaning in the academy, and it just kind of slowly seemed to filter down and then get popularized. And with the 2016,
Election.
Ferguson, and then, so Black Lives Matter really came to the fore. And then again, of course, with George Floyd, these ideas really came to the floor in a very popular way. And all of a sudden, white supremacy was sort of everywhere. It was kind of, it became synonymous with racism. And of course, that's one of the things that we were told, hey, don't talk about this. Don't hold an event like this, because you're basically asking whether racism exists. And that's an offensive thing to ask. And my argument is, no, that isn't what we're asking. We're asking whether white supremacy, as it used to be discussed, is what is being talked about by your average journalist today.
Right.
Because that is coloring our country. It's coloring our society in a way that I think is extremely detrimental. I think that race relations are worse now than they've been probably in decades.
It seems like maybe there's been more division as we've tried, maybe it's a genuine effort to try reconciliation, but it ends up sort of separating two camps. I mean, I remember when all of this conversation really came to a head after George Floyd, feeling so nervous when I would talk to my Black friends, like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Whereas like a few months before, we were just talking, I don't know if you felt that same thing on, or if you want to maybe kind of throw out what you think white supremacy might mean now, or do you think it means the same thing now that it did when we referred to like the KKK or something?
I definitely think that is the common understanding of white supremacy. So I won't act like I'm, doing the world a favor by having a alternative to that. But I do think it's a little bit more complex. And this is actually, I'll do my little marketing. There's a book that I recommend a lot of people read. It's called The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. And she has a very sound way of not having a tone of demeaning the history of what demeaning white people, but it follows the historical traits, the characteristics of how did not even the notion of white supremacy, but race, which race is a construct that's no more than 150 years old.
Yeah.
We didn't, our ancestors didn't identify people by the color of their skin. You were identified by your land, your language, and your culture. How you dressed was even an indicator of where you came from. And so I think with that, white supremacy definitely is, just by the word, the understanding that someone is superior. This group of people is superior. But I think one of the things I've enjoyed about that book is that was birthed out of Eurocentrism. And so what was, quote unquote, racism towards other whites, where everyone was trying to track their lineage to what was, these Vikings who were not conquered and who was these great people. They had these noses like this and their head shapes, Syllabhic index, I believe, the study of skulls, and all of that stuff informed, and then it was used to enforce and create this idea of race, which then was used to enforce the idea of white supremacy. But then that, I think, is being muddled with white privilege, because I think there are a lot of people who may subscribe to white privilege, but they don't see themselves as better.
Say some more about that. Maybe distinguish. Sounds like at least the three of us are on the same page that white supremacy is this ideology that white people are superior. Okay. But what's white privilege? And I mean, gosh, we could have a whole podcast on that, but just let's break that down. And do you think it's a sort of intrinsic thing?
I think it's definitely not intrinsic, because I think they're all three have definitely all three of those terms I've used. I think they definitely have been extrinsic, because they've informed the very fabric of our society. There's a lot of people who have internalized white supremacy, and they're not white. I think a lot of people have internalized Eurocentrism, and they're not from Europe. And then there's a lot of people who have internalized white privilege, and they don't receive the benefits of that. So I think that white privilege, and these are my definitions, I've been thinking about this for a while after reading this book. I think Eurocentrism is the systems of whites where, a certain land, a certain area of Europe was considered greater than, there was a lot of Irish beef with Italians are less feminine or more feminine than men who come from this area.
Yeah, interesting.
So that formed, this sense of patriarchy and this affirmation of masculinity. And then you turn into white supremacy, where, of course, now it's just based on the color of your skin, but, seeing ourselves as superior. Theodore Roosevelt, in his presidential address, he was commanding Americans who were originally here before the wave of immigrants. He was telling them, okay, we need people of this certain stock to birth and have kids, because we're being watered down by these inferior cultures, and this is the president of the United States. And then white privilege, I think, is just those favors, those privileges. I don't think everyone at the Capitol riots was white supremacists. I think what we saw was people being confronted with the idea that, hey, I think I deserve some of these things that other people are getting.
Sure.
And so I think that's something that could be, deep down, it could be a very internal reality for a lot of us that, hey, I deserve this.
Like entitlement.
Entitlement. Perfect word.
So I think a lot of people would say there is such a thing as white privilege, but even at more rudimentary, there's just privilege. So there's lots of privileges. Like, you guys might have privileges I don't because you're men. People that are in a different class and have more money than I do on my ministry have more privilege than I do, or whatever.
Children born in a household with a mother and a father.
Yeah.
And that's one of the bigger picture points that I would make too. I actually just got done with a book. I brought it. It's called Coming Apart. It's by Charles Murray, who's a kind of a popular level sociologist. It's actually the state of white America, 1960 to 2010. So it's kind of interesting. It's actually about white America, and it's a beer can at the bottom and a champagne glass at the top, because it's about the radical disparity between a really very powerful, dominant elite culture and the sort of dissolution of many of the fabric of sort of middle class white America. But what's interesting is that at the end of the book, he says, well, let's include all the groups. And actually what you find is that it's virtually the same. The ways in which the poor to middle class whites see higher divorce rates, less stable families, less employment opportunities, less religiosity, things that we would consider maybe the virtues that are the building blocks of a stable society. All groups are in the same camp. Maybe whites are a little bit better off in some of those categories, and they are notably better off, I will say, in imprisonment categories. So I know that's one of the most debated topics of this whole thing in terms of privilege. But that said, the point is that it's not just a racial thing in which there is a growing divide between those at the top and those at the bottom. It seems to be affecting all groups. And if you look at the graphs, I mean, they even go up and down at virtually the same time.
You're saying it has much more to do with class. The division
that is his main argument, with some exceptions.
I take offense at the fact that it's a beer can on the bottom, because we're Theology on Tap and we drink beer. That's the low class.
Well, somewhere in the middle is like craft beer.
Yeah.
Not the cheap.
I'm going to drink my beer
Pepsi.
in a champagne flute at the next event, just to really throw everybody off.
But I wouldn't deny. I think someone would have to be rather foolish to deny white privilege.
Yeah.
I think in any society there is majority privilege, and I mean, for example, if I were to go to a majority black country, I would not have majority privilege there.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't demand minority privilege. So that now, does that make it right? Well, it depends. It depends in what way privilege is used. If privilege is used for the suppression of other people, of course I would say it's wrong. If it's used for purposes of discrimination, for example, I would say that that's wrong.
What's an okay way for privilege to be used?
Okay, well, so this was the now infamous the aspects and assumptions of whiteness. This has been around, I understand, for a while, but this was at one of the Smithsonian Museum, like the Museum of African American Studies or something. It's part of the Smithsonian Network, and it made rounds a year
You've
or two
seen
ago.
this, right, Joseph?
Mm-mm.
Really? This, like maybe a year or so ago. This got a lot of heat.
This kind of went viral. So it says aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture in the United States. And so just to list them quickly: rugged individualism, emphasis on scientific method, Protestant work ethic, status, power, and authority. I mean,
punctuality was one.
I am.
remember.
If I have a right to be offended, I am offended at that. Although I disagree with many of these things, I guess because I'm a white guy, But still, I even find it, untoward. I mean, and again, like in this book, this would be more categoristic of more upper class or elite, communities than not. In fact, that might be why they are there, and not. But anyway. So this would be an example where, what was the question? Privilege being
white
a good
privilege,
thing?
and then you said if it's used for ill, that's wicked.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know if these are examples of privilege, but I think some, like showing up somewhere on time, like that shouldn't be a characteristic of. I mean, we kind of joke about that. We have an Ethiopian church here that we host, and we kind of, we make jokes. We have a meeting at 10.
Right, we're on different times.
Like, they're on Ethiopian time, and so whatever. It's. I don't think we're being offensive because they laugh about it, but maybe they would say, yeah, well, I have to laugh about it because you're the majority, culture. So.
Well, so the thing that he's holding up for those not watching on YouTube or live, so just listening on the radio or whatever, is the installation that was put in at Smithsonian about whiteness. And the idea was that these were negative, right? Like, and by the way, they took this down very quickly because they got such a backlash.
Because they're aspects of white culture that if other cultures don't agree with, then it's a way that whites are using this kind of hegemonic influence toward other people. So for other people, time isn't as important. They'll show up when they show up. They'll get it done when they get done. But white people are like, no, the meeting starts at 9:30. And if you don't, then you're late. Then we'll judge you for being late. And other people are like, well, that's just not our culture. And I'm like, well, okay. Let's say we can disagree about how timely one should be.
Yeah.
But we have had legitimate, like people with PhDs arguing about like the whiteness of math.
Yeah.
When did math become something up for debate? The scientific method. You mentioned like Eurocentrism. This is, I think, actually where it gets really interesting and I think fruitful, because when you say Eurocentrism, the question kind of becomes, okay, do we have like an American sort of culture, right? The things that we actually think are really important. And can we trace those things back? Okay, let's say we trace it back to Eurocentrism. Can we trace it back further to our Judeo-Christian ethics? And see, I would argue that we can. And so I would
things
argue,
like what? Like freedom?
well,
like what?
Things like individual rights, things like human dignity and autonomy.
Yeah.
I mean, autonomy not in God's view, but with one another.
Right.
But raising women to certain elevations. I would say, for example, that slavery, just to take the most obvious racist sin. And by the way, I would actually say, you mentioned race as a construct, thank you, relatively new. I would actually disagree because when Joel McDermott, I interviewed him a long time ago about his book on slavery. He was one of the guys on the debate on social justice that we had. One of the things he did, because this book was a survey of laws, like American laws about race. And there were many laws to keep slaves down. Mm-hmm. But many of those laws, the slave who was a person was synonymous with a black person. And so they changed, over time, the laws just were against black people because they were all slaves. Like if you were black, you were a slave.
Synonymous.
And so I actually think that they knew very well that there were these concepts of race, and they used it against black people. So I do think it's a human construct, but I do think that there was clearly a belief that whites were superior, and that's why they could enslave. Mm-hmm. And the Northerners believe that too. They built all the slave ships in the North. So, and I'm a Southerner, so. But
no one gets off the hook for wickedness.
But I don't know what I was going to say. So again, I would acknowledge that racism and white supremacy and beliefs of superiority were very real and very ingrained into our culture, for sure.
But so some of the concepts that are on the, say, the Smithsonian thing are differences between cultures, like
I
the
think,
time
I think
one.
some of them are just virtues. They're just Christian virtues.
Okay.
I don't think they're white or black, but why are they associated with whites? Because whites are the majority culture, and I think
Right.
if you trace it back, Europe was by and large a Christian culture. Imperfect.
Well, where I was going with
Yeah,
that is
sorry.
that some of those ideas, there's like a assumed negativity too, right? Like this is good and this is not good. This is a value, or this is something we value. So some people value punctuality. That now that's bad because that's a white thing. And so I wonder if, part of the reason we're having this conversation is because it seems like this idea of racism and white supremacy and white privilege is now understood to just be like sort of baked into the system, and that it's this kind of incurable problem that's in the fabric of our culture, and that's where we have to start. We have to start with this idea that's like kind of baked in. All of these things are bad. And that you said something earlier, I wanted to get Joseph's take on something about this idea that all white people are racist, that you're starting from this space. And I think this is where the people that have a problem with critical theory would say, when they're telling my children in school to admit that they're a racist before they can be an anti-racist, before that they can fight these things, there's an unfairness there. So I'm curious to your thoughts if you think there's kind of an unfairness to working from this idea that like all white people are racist. It's baked into the fabric of our society.
Well, I think that I wouldn't make the claim as, a scholar that all white people are racist, but I do think there is an internalization, as we all in our privileged spaces. When people are talking, when this is created, I don't think that people are looking at individual case samples, but they are looking at systems.
Mm-hmm.
And any culture, any nation, any society has systems.
Yeah.
When God brought the Israelites out of Exodus, he again, brought a systematic religion to them so that he could break down some of these, just to make them a people.
Yeah.
Before they even entered to Canaan, there was this formulation of systems. And I think to deny that and then to attempt to defend that, I don't think that we can make the claim that white people are racist, but I do think, I wonder, what is there to defend? What is there, and what do you find offense by? Because one of the things that, and even with Europe being a Christian nation, one of the people who I think he has a sound doctrinal understanding of the faith, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. But when he was invited to preach in the New Lands, America, he was instructed not to preach against slavery. And he succumbed to that. He yielded to that, but we uphold him as this. And I think I won't even justify it. I think, and he yielded to that and succumbed to that. And there was this fervor, there was this zeal. Oh, the word of God is going forth. How does that compare to the burden of the preacher of not only Martin Luther King, not only these notable figures, but Jesus Christ, where that same fervor, that same zeal ultimately put him on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And so I challenge when we say that, all white people are not racist. We were Christian. I think that the systems and the history, not only John Wesley, but Martin Luther, he contributed to anti-Semitism, by saying, there was this zeal. It's so funny because Jews did it to Gentiles, and then we Gentiles did it to Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So you constantly see, and I'm actually doing a Bible study later today on Christian maturity not being about sin or not sin, but just living in flesh versus living in the spirit.
Okay.
And so,
I like that.
Martin Luther, we received the gift of salvation through Jesus Christ, who was raised as a Jew, subscribed to the systems of the Jewish religion to redeem not only the Jews, but Gentiles, which was not just everyone who was not a Jew. And we, in turn, say, okay, we need to burn synagogues. We need to get rid of the Old Testament, which was a heresy, which is why we have canon scripture. I think it was Marcion's heresy. I'm not sure.
Marcion.
Yeah,
What a silly man.
but that's why we have canon scripture. We need it was trying to Gentiles trying to uphold this privilege of what we perceive to be they're Jews and we're now Christians or followers of the way and we're better. And I think that white people have to be careful of, okay, what are you defending? And what do you find offense towards? Jesus had a lot of privileges. One of my favorite sermons, again, E.V. Hill, he says, Jesus could have turned the stone into bread. It would have been no bearing on who Jesus was. But forsaking that privilege and suffering, being hungry, suffering to counteract and to be an example to us. And when, someone steals your coat, Jesus says, give them your other coat. And the only way to, I think, transcend and transform these societies, these systems that formulate the culture, and this system, this America, this wealth, these societies that have been built on the system of white supremacy, that's where we find out that Christ actually challenges us a little bit more than we like. And that's where liturgy doesn't define our faith. But we actually see that something else is, which is why, the first commandment is love me first, and Jesus could, hey man, you can't even go to a funeral. It's my mother, it's my father. And so I say that to say that I think that there's this, she says it in her book, not only with people who have privileges, but there's this notion to kind of justify it. And that's why theology is not absent of any construct in our society. If there's a certain trend in our education, that same trend is taking place in our theology.
Yeah, and Evan kind of said that earlier.
Yeah, absolutely.
It always trickles down.
And so for I think what to transcend those systems, I think that there's some like I was saying, she says that there has to be, not only do we need to have this privilege, but we need to have this understanding that it's deserved, that I'm entitled to it. And that's where we try to use God language. That's where the prosperity gospel comes from, where there has to be this theological justification. And sometimes I think it's truthfully, we're the minority. And
as Christians, you mean?
Well,
who's the we?
As blacks.
Who's the we?
There we go. Perfect.
Yeah.
As blacks. And, Black Lives Matter is a great movement, but I wonder what is, with so many minorities being the minority, what is it that whites are being offended by? Because to be defending something, you have to have offense towards something. There's defense in office. So I wonder, just those are my two questions or takeaways. What is it that there's the defense of? Is it the defense of the privilege? Is it the defense of the systems, these realities?
It sounds like you're saying kind of two things. One, we have to talk about the systems, that there is some stuff baked into them, and that's historically goes back to all kinds of systems. But the second thing is, what are you taking offense to with this idea that all white people are racist? And I wonder if we can separate those out for just the sake of our conversation. I think systemic racism is, that's a doozy. And we can climb into that in a minute if we want to. But the sort of teaching right now that all white people are racist, you say, what do we take offense to? I think it goes back to what Evan was saying about bearing false witness. I think the only way you can call me racist is if I've given some sort of evidence to that. In the same way that I could call you any awful thing, like you're rude. Well, I would have to have some evidence of that. And so to say something about somebody that it hasn't been borne out, I think is,
and if it's related to our great national sin, it's a really horrible thing to say to somebody.
Right. It's like the worst thing. It's not
Yeah.
the same as saying that somebody's rude. And so I think that's the offense. And maybe we have to separate those things out. Yeah.
And I would say though, and that's true. And I think, to Evan's point, I think, I trust God with everything that we see God does in scripture. And so bearing false witness is, I think not only an offense to people, an offense to God, but I think the evidence is not as objective as we would like.
Okay.
I call myself, I'm a Christian, and I'm not a capitalist. I have this thing where I'm a conspiracy theorist. I'm always, thinking, but I have on Adidas right now, and these were made in a sweatshop. So
there's inconsistencies there.
Yeah, and I think that those you don't have to wear a KKK hoodie now to be a white supremacist. You don't have to not be a Christian in order to have some internalized values of white privilege. And so I think that what we have to challenge ourselves is, and what only Jesus Christ can do, where he says, nothing will be hidden. There's nothing. And so I think when that light is cast on us, that evidence is not as objective as we would like. There's a lot of things that this society doesn't do that we did in 1920 and 1800s. But I think there's still the evidence of, and I think that's where those things are revealed in conversation. Where
interesting.
One of the things that the oppressor does to the oppressed is tries to take his voice, his perspective. One of the things that conquerors used to do is go into oppressed lands that they conquered and try to tell them, okay, this is what you need, this is what you deserve. No, this is not. And just even from a practical standpoint, you don't have the vantage point to identify. You won't be able to see if this is racist or if this is not racist. And though we can say that, I think, I would never tell someone who's been raped, oh, that didn't hurt that bad. Mm-hmm. Or I don't have, just from a logical perspective, mm-hmm. I don't have that experience, right, to even speak to. Me and my girlfriend had our biggest fight when I tried to tell her, I wonder if I think that there's pleasure when a woman is raped, where we had that thing about women being lustful and we ignoring some of the things that take place towards women. And I remember I said that. And here I am, a man, for one.
You're still alive and standing after that.
Yeah, and I was challenged and I was drawn back because, for one, what gives me the right, my privilege, to say that, and sometimes our opinion functions as privilege. But then, two, how could you identify on that? And I remember she said, well, if you on crack, just get off crack. And I'm like, well, have you ever done crack? Have you ever smoked crack? How do you make that theoretical leap to speak on that? And so I think that's the challenge right now for not just white people, but all privileged groups, but especially white people, given, again, not making it what other nations did in other countries, but the context that we're living in. Because that's a lot of times how this prosperity gospel eisegetes scripture, where we don't take into account the context of what scripture was. And we don't say, what Jesus was in Babylonia. He lived during Roman imperial, so.
I hear you saying, and then I want to get to some of the articles that Evan brought, but I hear you saying that this idea that there ought to be evidence brought, you should have evidence of something before saying it, that sometimes that evidence is really insidious. It's hard to see because it may be even just as inconsistent as.
And can only be seen by the oppressed. That's the.
Oh, okay.
That's the birth of liberation. That's the hard part when you don't have the lens. I think it's what Jesus says. Not to only remove the plank, not to only get it out of your eye, but to be effective in getting something else out of someone else's eye. You have to first get it out of your own. Like, you'll be doing more damage and more harm trying to tell this person, get this out your eye. You'll be poking and digging in your eye because you still haven't
a log in yours.
And yours is huger. Yours is bigger. And that is an eternal word for all of us. And we're constantly challenged by that. And so I think that's the hard part for people to reconcile with, where, when you're in power, Jesus says to flip that power. sit at the least table, sit at the seat where you're not going to be acknowledged. And that's a practical step for all of us.
I'm curious, Evan, your response. I mean, I'm getting out of the role of moderator here. Let me pull back. Do you have a response to this idea that even some of those distinctions can only be seen by the oppressed? If you're going to label somebody as a racist,
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. In fact, let me go back on the way that the people ought to know better oppress other people. Christians were oppressed in fits and starts, not everywhere, by the Roman Empire for something like 300 years. Then with the Edict of Milan, blah, 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 Christianity is not only legalized, but it's the official religion of the Roman Empire in, I don't know, 325 or whenever it was, 350. And what do? They killed pagans. They turned around and killed pagans. Now, they should have known better, right? They should have known better. So I do think that history is replete with examples of Christians who ought to have known better. In Joel McDermott's book, which I have extra copies of in my office next door, I'll be glad to hand any out to anyone who wants one. Call now and you can win one.
Oh my gosh.
He
goes through many preachers, not just John Wesley, but many preachers who absolutely knew better and did not say, they did not speak truth to power. And I'll even say this might shock some of you. In the last 4 or 5 years, I've grown more sympathetic to some of the arguments of liberation theology when it comes to criticizing rampant, politically connected corporations.
Yeah.
In fact, much of the populist political movement in America right now is very much against corporate power and very much against the collusion of corporate power. For example, pharmaceuticals, social media company, Google, things of that nature, and government. So I actually I might need to reread some of that old liberation theology and say, actually I can agree with some of the critiques of towards corporate interests and things like that. But Joseph mentioned earlier, I think he used the phrase white values. And so...
Oh, I didn't hear that.
I might be wrong about that, but I would be curious as to what those are. And I think I would not deny that there are certainly some things that many white people hold that are wrong. But my question would be, are there things that are called white values that are not native, if you will, to white people? What are the origin of those values? Are they defensible? So anyway, I don't know. There was a lot there, but
yeah, I'm realizing this conversation is much bigger than I think we even realized when we put it on the table. Let's do this. So Evan, you have been sort of scouring some of the headlines, especially recently, for places where white supremacy is now being used very differently from how it used to be used. Do you want to share some of those with us? And maybe we can toss them around and see if Joseph thinks they're...
Yeah, because again, if you go back to the social justice conversation we had on this podcast a couple of months ago, one of the things that Joel kept saying was, well, but the scholars really don't say it like this. Well, that may be the case, but their disciples, okay, their progeny, if you will, they do say it like that. And so like Abraham, X. Kendi or whatever, okay, he's like a second tier scholar, okay, and then the real scholar is a lot more nuanced in the way they say things. Okay, fine. But your average journalist reads Abraham X. Kendi.
Ibram.
Thank you. And it's even less nuanced.
Yeah.
And now it's just, oh, okay, I got it. White supremacy.
And then by the time it trickles down to us on Facebook, it's a meme.
Yes, exactly. And so there's like no, so these are, I just have a stack of headlines. Okay, I'm just going to read the headline. Virginia high school English teacher faces calls to be fired for claiming on video that telling kids to sit still is, quote, white supremacy. That goes back to that list, I think, though, of like, well, not everyone learns sitting still, right? Like in some cultures, we don't sit still and we learn, right? But sitting still is a white thing, this one actually is the most troubling to me, to be honest. Jimmy Fallon audience cheers news of 2020 census showing white population in decline.
I wonder how much of the audience was white. And they're clapping and they're like, don't be mad at us. Like,
I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if it was a lot. High school cancels 9/11 tribute saying it could offend some students. In other words, red, white, and blue garb wearing by, really patriotism itself is seen as a version of white supremacy now. So I think that's something that we would need to talk
Real
about.
quick, were the students that they thought would be offended Muslim students because of the nature of 9/11? Or was it just the idea that patriotism is offensive in its kind of whiteness?
I don't know.
I think both of those are valid, though. I
Okay.
think whether it was, for the basis of Muslim students, with this being, a melting pot of so many cultures, and
Yeah.
Houston, Texas, I think being the most cultural
We're the best. Yes.
city.
No, I think we
this
love
is really
most
big on the
It has
airport.
the
when I
most
first-
number of foreign language in its schools. So by that metric, we're the
Okay.
most diverse city in America.
Yeah. So I think either way, any of those points are valid, because to your example, and I love to hear more of those, because those are laughable. But then I think even that is problematic on my part to say that, oh, whoa, those are funny, like that's problematic, because the same example of those Christians who killed pagans, the assimilation into Roman dominance. The reason Christianity was legalized was not for Christianity to be validated. It was because Rome was losing power. And so when we say, okay, this group was Christians, okay, this group is Christians, I think it relates. I remember talking to my lady who I still love, dearly love, and we were having a conversation, and it was my intention, of course I wouldn't do that again, to make her believe that patriotism was actually a reflection of her theology, not her theology being somewhere else and then her upholding the flag. Because I think one of the things we have to challenge, okay, is all bloodshed for the flag, is that justified? Would we make the theological claim that this is the will of God? Because then those same notions have been made within manifest destiny. The same claim was made on African shores, that you people are uncivilized, we are doing you a favor. And we find out, oh man, this is not. So we're constantly being pruned, as the scripture says. We're constantly being pruned by that. So I think that those either way, if it was for Muslims or if it was people being challenged, I think patriotism might not be the best thing. I think it's not for anyone to determine whether right or wrong, but I think we have to empathize and sit with those stories, because all of those historical examples we could use at one point, again, that's something that I fell in love with. It wasn't about Christianity. It was about Rome, upholding Rome. And instead, the persecution of Christians was killing Rome. So they had to, put now from being martyred, where Jesus affirmed, you guys, all of his apostles, including women, you guys are going to be killed. And then you realize, oh man, I'm not being pursued anymore. I'm not being persecuted anymore. And I can be Christian. That's, and I recommend a lot of people, From Babylon to America. It's one of the greatest movies. Now, the second one was terrible. I don't know what he did.
Wait, what is this a book or a movie or what?
It's a movie on Amazon Prime. It's for free.
Okay.
From Babylon to America.
Free if you have the privilege of having Netflix.
He makes
Amazon.
a claim.
Amazon.
I won't agree with his general thesis, but the information and the work that he does leading up to that is valid. So
We'll check it out.
Can I just, this is totally going back a little bit, and I have a few more maybe headlines to read, but you mentioned Martin Luther, and of course being a Lutheran, this is something we've dealt with a lot, and there have been many apologies the Lutheran World Federation has made to Jews appropriately. I say many because it's like, I don't know how many times one can apologize for something they didn't do 500 years ago, but it's been done, and that's all fine and good. But a lot of people may not know that I believe 1520 or 1523, Martin Luther wrote an evangelical appeal called That Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew. And everyone who reads Luther's 1543 treatise, which is horrible and indefensible toward the Jews, that he did write, this is a guy who okay, everyone was anti-Semitic in the day, right? Which isn't justifying it. But he did step way out of the mainstream in reaching out in an evangelical way to Jews. And his appeal was Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, et cetera, et cetera. It was very loving, very tender. And so Well, the older Luther we were quite embarrassed of. The younger Luther, I think if we're looking for solutions to these sorts of problems, right? Of minority culture, majority culture, going beyond tolerance and towards engagement. That 1523, I think it was 20 years apart, 1523 essay would be well worth reading.
He's younger when he wrote.
Yeah, he was in his early 40s or so, born in 14.
And so when he was older, that's when he kind of moved towards the
older, wiser,
anti-Semitism.
more tender.
Way more constipated. No.
Okay.
Older, he was very harsh toward the Jews. Younger, as a younger
That's
man,
what I thought you
he was
said.
very tender. Yeah. I joked about constipation, but he was in extremely poor health toward the end of his life. And that's not justifying harsh things he said.
Sure.
But he was a miserable wretch for the last few years of his life. So
if you want to be a Lutheran, reach out to Evan at no.
But I am just trying to give an example though of a way that someone that we would all agree said horrible things about a race of people. But there was another time when the model he gave early would be an excellent model for us to follow, because I think it was true engagement. I mean, it doesn't totally apply. But just a few more headlines, and I think this one is interesting because there are two about Larry Elder. Right, Larry Elder recently ran for governor of California on the recall. Didn't quite make it.
Didn't quite. But he really didn't make it.
Yeah. Well, I do think he won I think he got. They didn't recall Newsom, but if they did, I think he would have won.
He was the next. Yeah.
But that said, white supremacy with a tan. That was a pretty controversial CNN article that came out just before the recall.
It was
election.
about Larry Elder.
It was about Larry Elder. And then Los Angeles Times, this one actually went really viral. Larry Elder is the blackface of white supremacy. You've been warned. That one got a lot of coverage, but there's the language of
what does that mean?
Because he sort of betrayed his own people. Larry Elder's a black man who was running on
the Republican
ticket.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he's more or less a libertarian, and so he argues against a lot of the leftist views, of sort of traditional democratic views, I guess, of race and so on. And
actually put together a documentary, Uncle Tom, where he talks about this idea of, well, exactly what we're talking about. You should check it out. I think you have to go to uncletom.com to watch it.
This gets to what we were talking about earlier. And I'm not defending this. I actually think some of this sounds kind of strange. And like the phrase white supremacy would need a lot to be peeling apart. But it says, the headline is, I think it's from Vanity Fair, Republicans are basically starting a white supremacist caucus. So again, these are words that are thrown out. I think it's extremely inflammatory. But, and so I think maybe some of the people involved, it's called the America First Caucus, right? And so we can really dive deep on like, well, what does it mean America First? And are they really just promoting white values? And it's like, well, again, whites are the majority in America, and it could be that their values, they can defensively argue, are more or less Christian values, the sorts of values that gave rise to what we call the West. They're not bad values. But
on what merit? Just because I like that. I like how you're clarifying that. But what do you hold the accountability of them towards? Is it like how do you measure? A good thing? Yeah, how do you measure? What is the?
As a Christian, I would have to say Christian law. And the gospel.
Scripture, yeah.
I mean, again, all of these, like the American founding, the American project, to defend it as a Christian, I think you would have to be able to trace the language, the nature of the founding back to Christian principles. Now, I think that can be done. I think that, for example, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I kind of wish it had said property, which it originally said, and they changed it to pursuit of happiness. But I think that you can take concepts of these things, that we should be free to pursue these things. You can trace them back to decidedly Christian teachings. As an example, Jesus takes a child, right? And he says, if you welcome, you need to welcome me like you welcome one of these children, right? Children were barely above slaves in the household. And the moment he did that, forever, it's just assumed now. I mean, now we have Little League parks, we have self-esteem sessions for kids. I mean, they are the center of our world. We have minivans, we have children's television.
The children are the future.
Exactly. I mean, how did we get to that place? I think that if Jesus had not done that with that child, we would not have the culture we have now of elevating and equalizing children in the household, even getting them too high a place in the household. My point is that there are things in Christian culture that are very deep that we even forget where they come from, you know? And so I do think that there are particular values that Christianity brought to the world that are good values, that are a benefit to people, that are American values that people want to preserve, and the people arguing for those values are white. But that doesn't make them white supremacists. What they want are for all people to participate in those values.
Yeah, one of the values is equality, wouldn't you say? I mean, that gets back to the there is now no Jewish.
But then we get into equity, right? I mean,
which has to be accounted for, because
yeah,
you know, I think that, you know, for one, Christianity is a construct just like white supremacism. Yeah, you know, because even us using
would
the
you
term,
say like who's Christianity?
Well, not even who. I think it's just cultural understanding. You know, when a Lutheran saying I'm a Christian and a Baptist is saying I'm a Christian, we are just two understandings of that, and there are so many more to be identified for, and we're constantly being exposed to that, and I think that has to be accounted for. And I would beg to differ that America is founded. You know, George Washington, and I remember at a religious freedom conference that is hosted by Washington D.C. He said this is not a Christian nation. A lot of people. That is, you know, that is, I think, one of the misinterpretations of the foundation of the country. You know, George Washington, he wanted to establish that the value, which was to be a housing agent, to open its arms, Lady Liberty, you know, to open its arms to all of the that language. Mm-hmm. What it was, which is why I like the Book of Eli. Which is why I like the Book of Eli. Though language is used from the Bible. At one point, you could put, the Book of Eli, the movie.
The Denzel Washington.
Yeah, how the guy was just pursuing him just to get the words.
Yeah.
He just wanted the words that he was, and then when he finds out it's not a book, but it's actually on his heart, that destroys him because he just wanted to use the language. But one of the things I think that at one point in time, you could pull it from a scripture to justify chattel slavery. Mm-hmm. At one point in time, you could make the claim and prove it in scripture that black people, a race, was the cursed sons of Ham. So, so there's always, so I think one of the things we have to do is kind of, you know, okay, we can prove even the data we use cannot account for. Until I always say it like this: until you can count the hairs on your head, your data is not valid.
Until you're God,
until you're God, you're going to have to account for it. And that's what Job is challenged for, and his friends. You know, to where, that's one thing, because we're even in this healthy conversation. There's two different understandings of the birth of this nation, of the term white supremacy, and I can say that. None of it has been offensive, unhealthy, or a sign of a white supremacist. But I think that the challenge is, where do we go from here? What are the goals in having this? And that's why, you know, I was called and I forgot the term. My girlfriend was called an ambiguous thinker, and I was called, it starts with an F.
I don't know.
But anyway,
fierce, fantastic, fabulous. Those are the words that come to mind.
Foundationist? No.
A fundamentalist.
Fundamentalist.
Oh, we get called that a lot. So join the club.
And I definitely am. I've been called a conservative because one of the things, everybody has their own claim, and one of the things I was telling some of my friends who are same gender loving, I was saying, okay, so we're justifying homosexuality, that there needs to be a claim to accept that. You know, if you stand up against homosexuality, not to make it a tangent, then you're a homophobe. And I was like, you know, now, when are we going to be able to have the same empathy towards what we are claiming pedophiles? Are we going to be able to have the same claim towards bestiality? So that's a tangent, but everyone has that voice, and everyone can ultimately have justification. But I'm always wondering, what is measuring that? What is that accountable to? Because even the Bible says not all questions are just healthy. You know, where we're as scholars, being in seminary, just some of the questions that would be asked, like, where is that coming from? And then you know, scripture lets us know it's just arising from your pride, your ego, your flesh.
Well, you said something interesting, and I hate having to like draw this to a close, but we are well beyond time. I don't know if y'all know that.
Yeah.
So let's wrap. I mean, gosh, we could talk for forever, but come on October 11th and put your own questions into the mix for our larger panel. But what do we do with this? So yes, we don't agree necessarily on some of our definition of terms, and we've maybe found more nuance and more cracks that we could, you know, go into to talk more. But as Christians, just the three of us are the we for this. What do we think the gospel has to offer to this conversation and to moving us forward? Maybe each of you can just kind of take a stab at last words about where the gospel speaks to this.
Well, native to the Bible itself were different ethnicities and formerly warring tribes that made peace at the cross of Christ. We don't have. I mean, I do think the church has authority beyond the church. So I say we. I mean all Christians. But that said, we do have that authority. But realistically, you know, we need to model as best we can, you know, the kind of peace that you do see, like in Colossians, you know, barbarians and Scythians, right? You know, coming to Greeks and Jews, coming together around the lordship of Christ. That should be our focus as Christians. That should be preeminent in our thinking. I would hope that would be preeminent among all who claim the name of Christ, that the lordship of Christ would be, you know, our predominant way of identification, that we're not white Christians or black Christians, but we are followers of Jesus. So I would hope that within the Christian church that would be, you know, the way we go, which doesn't ignore our differences or cultures.
Yeah.
I think that if we can start in the right place, then I think we can have better conversations. Starting with the place that, again, what I think could be a violation of the commandment against, you know, bearing false witness. You know, I think that's a really tough place to start. I do think that, I'll say, white people, I think, need to not be so defensive about the horrors that a white, you know, society did produce. Own it. I don't think we should be in denial of that, for sure. And I think that we often are. I would agree with that. Mm-hmm. I think that we are often in denial of really sinful systems. So, on the other hand, I do think that a lot has changed in our country since, you know, the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, by and large, for the better. So now maybe, again, I'm not even thinking that. But so I don't know. And you know, I'll say one last thing. This is a question. I don't know the answer to this. But should there be more intentional effort made between, say, white churches and black churches to do things together? Or would that feel forced? I don't know. I mean, I would like to see it, you know, if I could snap my fingers.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
More thoughts for maybe a future podcast. Yeah. But do you want to kind of offer where does the gospel fit into this conversation?
Well, first of all, let me thank you guys, because this is my first time actually learning how to listen. Like, and I had to study you guys' podcast to know how to do that. And I think this is a wonderful platform. So I just want to commend you guys on continuing to do this.
We would love to have you back. This has been great.
What is the gospel? What does the Bible, what do Christianity have to say about it? Well, I don't think the gospel has anything to say about race. I don't think the Bible has anything to say about race. I don't think Christians have anything to say about race, but all three of those have a lot and everything to say about humanity. And so I think that needs to be the recovery. You know, we need to move from the white supremacy, I think. And I'll say this very carefully because I think it's used to defend white supremacy, white privilege, but we need to be careful about Black Lives Matter. We need to be careful about our liberation movements and move towards the eye of God, which is always watchful over humanity. And even in the Old Testament, God constantly reminds them that, hey, I'm doing this work with you guys, but, you know, don't glean your fields because people who are strangers, you know, need to eat. God is constantly watching and being mindful over humanity, not just his privileged and his called and his Christians and chosen. But then secondly, I think that we all are, in this day and time, we have to respond to the clarion call of choose ye this day whom you will serve.
Yes.
Because before you get to bearing false witness, love God. And then, really, Jesus says, and I excuse me if it's wrong on this podcast, to hell with all 10 of those. Those are in the fabric of loving God and loving your neighbor.
Right. It's not to hell with them. They're already included in those first.
You don't even have to consider,
Right.
If you're trying to account for the 10 commandments, most likely you are not operating in the two.
If you're trying to check boxes,
you're clearly not.
No murders today. I'm good.
Yeah, and I think that's where we have to really, and we're all, and he couples that with, you cannot serve two masters.
Yeah.
And that's why I say, when we can attach some of these ills to not what our ancestors did, but to what we are actively doing.
Mm-hmm.
I challenge us, where, can we really say that we're American and Christian? Can I really say that I'm a liberationist and Christian? Because even those terms, they are identifiers. So just as a practical standpoint, we're constantly challenged. Can I be a good son, Jesus, to my father and follow you? No, you can't. Can Zacchaeus is, and I'll leave it with this, Zacchaeus is mind-boggling to me. I think this is exactly what reparations is, but more than that, Zacchaeus goes out of his way. And I was like, Lord, does he have a confession? Does he have a confession? Because we believe that if you believe in your heart and confess with thy mouth, then you are saved. He says to Jesus, Lord, and that was enough for me. It was mind-blowing. And then he goes out of his way. He says, everyone, not that I've only done harm to, but everyone that I have a privilege over, I give them double what I took from them. I give them double, not only to acknowledge and repent, but to repair the damage. And we're all called to that. And he does without being told it. He does what Jesus commands the rich young ruler to do.
Interesting.
He does. He does what the first miracle of the church was not building a church, having a miracle, but everyone bringing, selling their homes and bringing the money to a pile.
That is a miracle.
Mm-hmm. That's the first miracle. That's when the Holy Spirit fell, which we claim, the Holy Spirit that makes us, in the Black church shout, and some other churches makes us, talk in a certain way, think in a certain way, makes, a meta narrative of America, whatever it is. The first, according to scripture, and according to what we subscribe to, the first miracle was there was a cause. People are not eating. People don't have homes. Mm-hmm. And those that joined this body, every single one of them, and we see how seriously God takes that by Ananias, Ananias and Sapphira. So that's I think the call that we have. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And that has to be the question we ask ourselves every day. And then that'll be better when we come to these conversations, because we can be just authentic and have an integrity.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love it. Since we are over time, I'm going to skip the where can we find you. All the information you need can be found at HoustonTOT.com. Even if you want to talk to our new friend, Joseph Parks, we'll put you in touch with him. Contact us there, HoustonTOT.com. Thank you for listening and for joining us. Come to the event on October 11th. If you're a young adult here in Houston, it's at St. Arnold's, 7 to 9. You can register. I know you'll be surprised to hear it's at HoustonTOT.com is where you can find that. Yeah, Joseph will be there and we'll be there. It'll be great. And until we talk to you guys next, we encourage you, as always, to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.